Hey guys, it's Chris from Highline Guitars and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I am going to pick up where I left off in the last episode, part 6. And if you haven't had a chance to watch that, I'll put a link up here so you can go back and get caught up. But in this episode, part 7, I'm going to install the neck, the bridge, and some of the electronics. Now, I won't get to the pickups. That's going to come in the next episode. I'm going to be actually making those. So, got a lot of work to do, and let's jump in and get started. Before I could install the neck, I had to use my Dremel with a little drum sanding bit in order to clean some of the built-up finish in the holes where I will be inserting the neck bolt ferrules. I didn't want to leave the wood raw here, so I just brushed in some black paint to kind of dress it up a little bit. As you can see here, the neck fit is neither too tight nor too loose. It's just snug. And once the neck was into the pocket, I flipped the body over and installed my stainless steel neck ferrules. The screws that I'm using to attach the neck are stainless steel number 8 1¼ inch long oval head screws. And here you can see the result. There are no gaps. To position the bridge accurately, the first thing I have to do is move the saddles all the way forward and then back about 1/8 of an inch. Then what I'll do is I'll measure from the 12th fret to the front of the saddle where the string would be contacting the saddle, and that distance has to be half the scale length, which would be 17 inches. And then to make sure that the center line of the bridge is square with the center line of the body, what I'll do is I'll measure from the corner of the neck to the corner of the bridge, and I'll make sure that this measurement is exactly the same on both sides. And then to make sure that the bridge is centered with respect to the neck, I'll use a length of sewing thread pulled between the saddle and the where it will contact the nut. And then I'll check to make sure that the distance between the string and the edge of the fretboard is equal on both sides. And then once I'm satisfied I have the bridge properly positioned, I'll use a center punch to mark where I need to drill the pilot holes for mounting the bridge. Now there is one last thing I have to do before I can permanently install the bridge, and that is to run a ground wire from underneath the bridge down into the control cavity where it can be soldered to the ground coming in from the jack. A small piece of copper tape will hold the stripped end of that wire so that it doesn't accidentally slide down into the body as I'm installing the bridge. I hate running the risk of a broken screw, so I'm going to drill pilot holes for each of the mounting screws. The bridge that I'm using is a 4-string Gato bridge, and boy, it sure has a lot of screws to attach it. Now with the neck and the bridge installed, I was ready to move on to wiring up the controls. And the first thing I need to do is to make sure that the pots are going to fit into the holes that my CNC cut. Now originally they did, however the application of finish plugged up those holes a little bit. So I'm using a reaming tool to ream out the holes until the shafts of the pot fit nice and snug in those holes. Next up was to line the control cavity with copper foiling, and this is in an effort to reduce the potential for electromagnetic interference. And it's kind of a controversial step. Some people say it works great, other people say it's not worth the time, but it really isn't that difficult to do. So I do it anyways, just for insurance purposes. Now I don't want to leave that sloppy looking edge around the top there, so I'm going to trim away the excess and leave a nice clean foil border. Next up was wiring the controls, and here I'm tinning all the leads and the lugs and getting ready to solder the wiring together. Now I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here because in truth that could take up an entire video by itself. But what I will say is that I'm using just standard Fender precision based wiring, and it's a volume pot, a tone pot, and a jack, and that's really all there is to it. But I'll tin all the leads and all the lugs, and then I'll start cutting and stripping wiring and soldering everything into place. And it's a pretty simple process. I don't typically use really fancy wiring when I'm wiring up my guitars. I go with standard wiring, and that helps me to keep the cost of my guitars down. Plus, you know, since guitar modding is such a popular sport among guitar players, if you want to do something unique and exotic, by all means, you can do that yourself. I'm just going to keep it pretty standard here. Now, after I've done as much of the wiring as I can outside of the guitar, I'm ready to install those components into the cavity, and I'll get as much of the remaining wiring done as possible. And that'll include soldering the ground from the bridge to the back of the pot, as well as installing and soldering the jack. Now, once I have all this soldering complete, there is one last bit of wiring that needs to be done, and that is the installation of the pickups. However, I haven't even made the pickups yet. That's going to happen in the next episode. When I'm soldering in the control cavity, I like to keep the pot somewhat loose so I can move them around a little bit as I'm finishing up that last bit of soldering. And once I'm done, I can then tighten the nuts. And as you'll notice, these shafts are split shaft, and typically that means you have to use a split shaft knob. But I like to use knobs that are secured in place using a hex screw. And what I'll do is I'll position the knob so that the hex screw is actually going to tighten into the slot on that split portion of the shaft. And that allows me to get a pretty tight connection for each of the knobs. And then finally, the last step for today was to secure the jack into the lower bout of the guitar body, and that's done with a couple of wood screws. Well, guys, that's all the time I have for this episode. And in the next episode, I'm going to, hopefully, depending on how the schedule works out, make the pickups, and I'll get those installed and wired up. And then probably in an episode following that, I'll start the setup of the guitar. And, you know, this is all sort of fly by the seat of the pants video work. So, you know, who knows how this will all come together, but as you can see, it is coming together. So until the next episode, I hope you have a great weekend, a great week ahead, and be sure to click that subscribe button down below and click the bell for notifications and give me a thumbs up, all that other good stuff, and we will see you soon.